Anyways, I've gotten off track. I was talking about the similarities between Italy and Japan in terms of the world wars. Both minor players on the Allied powers during the First World War, and as minor powers, they didn't receive very much out of the wars. That led to resentment on the parts of Italy and Japan, and so, when nationalism began to rise in Central European nations like, for instance, Germany. Not sure if you were aware, but they had actually a pretty big role in the Second World War. Italy and Japan kind of jumped on the bandwagon as a way of getting back some of the stuff they wanted to get with the peace in World War I. And one of the reasons they didn't actually get those things was because the peace was, for the most part, negotiated by the American President Woodrow Wilson, whose first name was actually Thomas, and he was also a doctor. A titular doctor, not a medical doctor. Let's see, which research do we want? We're coastal now, so we could go sailing. Actually, let's go trapping. So we can improve these deers. And I completely forgot what I was talking about. Okay. Decisive victory. Decisive victory. Kill. And kill. Not very often you can see 4 guys attack 12 and kill every single one of them without taking any casualties. But yeah, peace was negotiated by the American President Woodrow Wilson, despite the fact that America didn't really play that big a role in the war. As far as the fighting is concerned, they played a pretty big role in the diplomatic half of the war, in that the mere fact that they had landed troops in Europe and were on the side of the Entente powers kind of compelled Germany to surrender, which is kind of why militarily the US didn't have a big role in the First World War. Because what had honestly happened... Oh, yes, please. Was that for the first 4 years of the war, Germany had been duking it out with Britain and France, and all of those countries had lost a considerable amount of manpower, which means none of them really had the military strength to fight up against another nation with actual military strength. But since none of them had enough military strength, the war could have been prolonged. Then all of a sudden you had a new player jump into the war and pour thousands and thousands of new troops into the side of your enemies, and the American army fought, I think it was 2 battles before Germany surrendered, just because they had no manpower, and suddenly there was a huge army heading towards their position. So, as I've said, America's role in the First World War was far more political than military. Militarily, it was the French and the British who held them off the entire time, making a victory possible, and kudos to those countries. They paid an enormous price to protect against foreign aggressors. However, and that much is admirable, but the political side of things is, yeah, Britain and France kind of screwed up in the political aspect of that, because, and this goes back to the actual peace in World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a very... well, honestly, he was probably the first actual modern liberal Democrat who was ever elected as U.S. president. And he had a lot of ideas of how to actually preserve peace and well-being amongst all the nations of the world. And so, negotiating for the Entente powers, he attempted to put all those...
Even brute beasts and wandering birds do not fall into the same traps or nets twice.
Put all those ideals into play. Things like free trade, self-determination, democracy, things which weren't really that widespread in Europe at the time. And unfortunately, due to both external and internal pressures, because, for instance, one of Wilson's ideas was the League of Nations, which was basically like an early precursor to the United Nations. And, by the way, once we become controller of the World Congress, I'm changing the name of it to the League of Nations. Because, believe it or not, I'm actually a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. And basically what the League of Nations was supposed to be was an international organization of all the great world powers which were colluding to try to enforce peace through collective defense. However, after the First World War ended, the ideas of putting America into a position where it might potentially wind up being pulled into a foreign war through collective protection became very unpopular as isolationist factions took over and kind of killed most of Wilson's ideas from the inside out. And while Wilson was trying to go for peace without any losers, some of the other powers which had lost a lot of young men during the war, like Britain and France, wanted to force Germany into paying reparations. Wow. What a fucking surprise. I'm not getting involved in this. We're not good enough friends. Shit, fucking Italy. No, fucking Mussolini. There's nothing wrong with Italy. Well, I mean, there's a lot of corruption in the Italian government. But Italy isn't the problem here, it's fucking Mussolini. And so, Britain and France wound up leeching Germany of tons and tons of money, which kind of collapsed their economy. I'm not sure, but I don't think there was any country that had it worse during the Great Depression than Germany. They went through hyperinflation where literally when winter came around and people needed to heat their houses, it was cheaper to just get bundles and bundles of Reichsmarks and burn those rather than trying to buy coal with them. Okay, so we destroyed the encampment. That's one thing off the bucket list. Road's almost finished. Ooh, almost forgot. Temple. Right after the library's done. Library. A few times during the last session as I was editing, I heard parts where my pronunciation of that word kind of sounded juvenile. It's library. One thing I find odd is that a lot of people seem to have trouble pronouncing a BR in a word if it's not right at the beginning. Like, for instance, with the word February. Most people say February because the R right after the B doesn't click with them. But I can assure you, it's February. And it's library, not library. Oh! I called that. Greece is trying to invade America. Good news, Washington. I have given up any plans I was making to invade you because now I'm gonna go after the warmonger. I know that statement might seem kind of ironic. So, shut up. Yeah, shut up. That's what we're going with. But, yeah, the victory conditions in the First World War crippled the German economies, and by that point in time, all of the economies in the world were becoming more and more interdependent on one another. So, when one economy fell, that means a few more are going to domino out. Like, for instance, Britain and France were demanding heavy reparations from Germany, something we've already established. And as a result of those reparations, I'm not 100% sure on the details, but it was a lot of money they were getting in. And since throughout the war, America had been granting a lot of debts to the Western Entente powers, debts which, for the most part, had been assumed they would just be forgotten, considering the massive, massive losses that those two countries faced during the war. But you also have to keep in mind that it was during the Wilson administration, and his dream of a global world with peace assurances and an international organization to enforce peace. Catholicism.